The alarm on my wrist buzzed so hard it felt like it was trying to crawl off my arm. I was already awake. Nobody sleeps well the night before they meet a species from another star. My name is Ethan Bailey, and 3 hours ago I was told I would be the one speaking for planet Earth. Not a president, not a general. Me, a mid-level fleet translator who happened to be fluent in the strange clicking language our new visitors used in their first broadcast. The shuttle shook as it broke through the clouds. Below me, the ocean looked calm, but my hands were not. Ahead of me, hanging in low orbit like a silver moon that did not belong there, was their ship. It was smooth, curved, and far too quiet for something so large. No exhaust trails, no visible engines. It simply sat there, waiting, like it had already decided how this meeting would go. 2 minutes to docking, said the pilot, a woman named Grace Whitfield, who had flown fighters before she flew diplomats. Her voice was steady, but I noticed her knuckles were pale against the controls. "Any new signals from them?" I asked. Just the same greeting, over and over. Polite, repetitive, like they are talking to a child. I did not like that comparison, but I understood it. Their first message, translated by our best linguists working around the clock, had said something like this: "Greetings, young species. We have traveled far to welcome you into the wider community of the stars. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid," as if fear was the only thing they expected from us. The shuttle docked with a soft click, so gentle I barely felt it. A door that seemed to be made of light more than metal slid open, and a walkway extended toward us, humming with a pale blue glow. Grace looked at me. "Well," she said, "this is the part where you talk and I stay quiet and look intimidating. You are very good at that second part." She almost smiled. Almost. I stepped onto the walkway first, because someone had to, and because I had spent my whole life wanting to know if we were alone in the universe. Now I was about to find out, and my stomach was doing something I did not have a word for. The inside of their ship was nothing like our starships. There was no metal groaning, no vibration of engines, no smell of oil or wiring. It smelled like nothing at all, clean and empty, like a room that had never been lived in. The walls curved instead of meeting at corners, and soft light came from no visible source, just glowing gently from everywhere at once. 3 figures waited for us at the end of the corridor. They were tall, taller than any human I had ever stood beside, with long limbs and skin the color of pale stone. Their eyes were large and dark, without visible pupils, and they moved with a slow, careful grace, like they were used to a lot more time than we were. The one in the center stepped forward. A soft device on its chest translated its clicks and tones into words that came out smooth and calm. "Welcome, Ethan Bailey of Earth. I am Ambassador Threll, of the Meridian Concordat. We are honored to greet a species so young, standing at the very beginning of its journey among the stars." Young. There it was again. "Thank you, Ambassador," I said, keeping my voice level. "We are honored as well." Threll tilted its head, the way a person might look at a puppy that had just done something clever. "You have accomplished much, for a species with so little time. Chemical rockets, basic orbital stations. It is impressive, in its own way." Basic. I felt Grace shift slightly beside me, though her face did not change. "We hope to learn from you," I said, because that was the line I had been given before I left. Learn, listen, do not provoke, do not brag. Those were the instructions from the people who were far more nervous than they let on. "You will," Threll said. "That is why we have come. Before your species can be welcomed properly into the community of worlds, you must understand what awaits you, the wonders we can offer, the peace we have built, over ages longer than your written history." Behind Threll, one of the other 2 aliens, smaller and quicker in its movements, studied me with open curiosity. It reminded me of a student sizing up a new arrival in class, deciding whether they were worth talking to. "We would like to extend an invitation," Threll continued. "A small group of your people may come aboard our vessel of guidance, what you might call our flagship, so that we may show you the achievements of our people. It is customary. When a new species joins us, that they first see how far peace can carry a civilization. I glanced at Grace. She gave the smallest nod, the kind that said she had heard the same briefing I had. Do not refuse anything. Do not appear weak. Do not appear proud either. We would be glad to accept, I said. Threll's mouth moved in something that might have been a smile, though it was hard to tell with a face built so differently from ours. Good. I sense curiosity in you, Ethan Bailey. Curiosity is a fine quality in the young. There it was a third time. Young, not dangerous. Not equal. Young. I wanted to say something about how our species had gone from riding horses to walking on our own moon in less than 70 years. How we had built and unbuilt whole empires. How we had learned to fly before we had learned to stop fighting each other about it. But I stayed quiet, because that was not my job today. My job was to listen and to watch. Over the next hour, Threll walked us through parts of the ship that were open to visitors. Every room felt built for calm. There were gardens growing plants I did not recognize, water fountains that made no sound, and long viewing windows that looked out onto the stars without a single scratch or smudge of use. It was beautiful. It was also, I noticed, completely undefended. No visible barriers, no warning signs, no sense that anyone here expected trouble. Your ship feels very peaceful, I said, testing the water. It is, Threll answered, sounding almost proud. We have not needed defenses of the old kind for a very long time. The Concordat settled its disagreements many generations ago. Conflict, as your species understands it, is something we grew out of, the way a child grows out of tantrums. I filed that comment away carefully, the way you file away a splinter you plan to deal with later. How many species are part of your Concordat? I asked. 43, at last count. Each brought in slowly, gently, once they proved themselves ready. Some take centuries to prepare, some take only decades. It depends on how quickly a species learns patience. And humans? How long do you think we will take? Threll considered this, tilting its head again. That remains to be seen. You are still very early, still testing your borders, still building tools of protection out of fear rather than confidence. It is understandable. Every young species does this. Tools of protection out of fear. I almost laughed, but I kept my face calm, the way Grace had kept hers this whole time. If Threll knew what was sitting quietly in orbit stations above our own planet, tools built not out of fear but out of a very long and very hard history, it might have chosen a different word than young. Near the end of the corridor, we passed a wide chamber filled with soft chairs arranged in circles, where several younger-looking aliens sat listening to a recording that played in gentle tones. Threll paused there, watching them with something close to affection. This is where our own young learn the history of the Concordat, Threll explained, the story of how we ended conflict among our founding worlds. It is required listening, even now, so many generations later. We never want to forget how much was lost before peace was chosen. How was it chosen? I asked. The peace, I mean. What made it stick? For the first time, Threll paused before answering, as if searching for a way to explain something too large for simple words. Exhaustion, it finally said. Our founding worlds fought amongst themselves for a very long stretch of our history. When it finally ended, none of them had the strength left to want it again. Peace was not chosen because we became wise. It was chosen because we became tired. I thought about that answer for longer than I probably should have. Exhaustion was not the same as growth. A species that stopped fighting because it ran out of energy was different from one that had never needed to test its limits in the first place. And since then, I asked, no conflict at all among any of the 43 worlds? None worth remembering, Threll said, a note of quiet pride returning to its voice. We resolve disagreements through discussion, through patience, through the slow work of understanding. It has served us well for longer than your civilization has existed. The smaller alien beside Threll, the one who had been studying me earlier, spoke for the first time. Its voice through the translator was higher, quicker. Forgive my curiosity, it said, but does your species still resolve disagreements the old way? With force? I felt Grace tense slightly beside me. I chose my words carefully. We are still learning, I said. We have not been exhausted into peace yet. The smaller alien tilted its head, clearly unsure whether that was meant as a joke. Threll simply nodded, as if my answer confirmed exactly what it already believed about us. In time, Threll said gently, you will understand that strength is not measured by what a species can destroy, but by how long it can hold itself back from destruction. That lesson took our people ages to learn. We do not expect you to learn it quickly. I said nothing more on the matter, though the words stayed with me long after we left that chamber. Somewhere far behind us, on a planet these visitors still considered young and unfinished, humanity had also learned to hold itself back. We had simply learned to do it while standing beside tools capable of ending everything, choosing every single day not to use them. That, to me, sounded like a different kind of strength than exhaustion, but it was not the moment to say so. By the time our tour ended, Threll returned us to the docking corridor with the same gentle politeness it had greeted us with. We will send the details of your visit to our flagship soon, it said. There, you will see the true measure of what peace can build. I believe it will change how your species sees its future among the stars. I am looking forward to it, I said, and for once, that was completely true. As the shuttle door closed, and we pulled away from that silent silver ship, Grace finally let out a breath she must have been holding the entire time. They really think we're children, she said. They think we're children who haven't thrown a real tantrum yet, I said, watching the alien ship shrink behind us. I wonder what they'll think when they see one of ours. Grace glanced at me, and for the first time since we had left Earth, there was something like a smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. Careful, Ethan, she said. You're starting to sound excited. Maybe I was. Because somewhere far below us, in shipyards most of the galaxy did not know existed, humanity had spent the last 100 years building things that had nothing to do with gardens or quiet hallways. And soon, one way or another, our new friends from the stars were going to see them. 3 days later, a message arrived through the relay station orbiting Earth, written in careful, formal Concordat script. Our visit to the flagship had been approved. I was to bring a delegation of 6, no more, no fewer, and Threll would personally guide us through what the message called the Vessel of Enduring Peace. I read that name twice before I laughed out loud in the briefing room. General Charles Doyle, who had spent 30 years commanding fleets and looked like he had never laughed at anything in his life, raised an eyebrow at me from across the table. Something funny, Bailey? They named their warship the Vessel of Enduring Peace, I said. Everyone names their weapons something nicer than what they actually are, Doyle said. We named ours things like Steady Hand and Quiet Storm. Doesn't mean they're gentle. That comment stuck with me the entire trip up. Our shuttle approached the Concordat flagship 2 days later, and this time there was no mistaking what it was. It was enormous, easily 10 times the size of the diplomatic vessel we had visited before, shaped like a long silver blade curved gently at both ends. Lights ran along its hull in slow, rhythmic patterns, almost like breathing. It did not look aggressive. It looked ancient, patient, and completely sure of itself. Doesn't look like much of a fighter, said Olivia Marsh, a young engineer who had been added to our group specifically to study alien hull design. She had her scanner pressed to the window the entire approach, recording everything she could. No visible weapon housings, no armor plating that I can identify, just smooth hull. Maybe that is the point, I said. Maybe they stopped needing obvious weapons a long time ago. Or maybe, Olivia said, they just don't expect anyone to ever test them. We docked without incident, and Threll met us personally at the airlock, flanked by 2 figures I had not seen before. Both wore deep blue robes, marked with silver patterns that Olivia later told me resembled rank insignia. Threll introduced them as Commander Ostron, who oversaw the flagship, and a younger officer named Vex Calor, who would be our guide through the ship's public sections. "Welcome aboard the Vessel of Enduring Peace," Threll said, and I noticed Doyle's mouth twitch slightly beside me. Today you will see the true achievement of the Concordat, not simply our gardens or our halls of learning, but the strength that protects them. Commander Ostrin stepped forward. Its voice, older and slower than Threll's, carried a weight that made even the calm corridor feel heavier. Many young species believe peace is the absence of strength, Ostrin said. We believe the opposite. Peace is strength so complete that it no longer needs to be shown. Walk with me and you will understand. The tour began in a long viewing gallery that ran along the outer hull of the ship. Through thick, transparent panels, I could see rows of smaller vessels resting inside docking bays, sleek and silver like their flagship, humming faintly with the same soft light. Vex Calor gestured toward them with clear pride. These are our Guardian-class vessels, Calor explained. Each one carries enough capability to defend an entire settled world on its own. We maintain a fleet of these across every member system, though thankfully, they are rarely needed for anything beyond training exercises. How old is this design? Olivia asked, scanner still recording. The Guardian class has served the Concordat for over 600 of your years, Calor said. It has required very little modification in that time. When something works, and there is no enemy pressing you to improve it, why change it? I caught Doyle's expression shift for just a second before he smoothed it back into a polite, neutral mask. 600 years without real modification. That was either a sign of incredible design or a sign of a fleet that had never truly been tested. We continued deeper into the ship, past training rooms where younger Concordat officers practiced coordination drills that looked more like dance than combat preparation. Slow, careful, synchronized movements meant to build unity rather than speed. Ostrin explained that most conflicts within the Concordat's long history had been resolved through overwhelming presence rather than actual engagement. Ships would simply arrive, in numbers too great to challenge, and disagreements would end before anything more serious occurred. You rarely have to actually use these ships then, I said. Rarely, Ostrin agreed. The last time a Guardian vessel engaged in true combat was over 2 centuries ago, against a group of raiders from an unaligned system. It ended quickly. They saw what waited for them, and they surrendered before the first shot was ever fired. And what if someone doesn't surrender? Doyle asked. His voice was calm, almost casual, but I had spent enough time around him to recognize the sharpness underneath it. Ostrin paused, considering the question like it had not been asked in a very long time. Then we would be forced to act, it said. Though I confess, it has been so long since that was necessary, I am not certain our current officers have ever needed to make that choice. The room went quiet for a moment. I glanced at Olivia, who had stopped scanning long enough to look genuinely troubled by that answer. A fleet that had not truly fought in over 200 years was not necessarily a fleet built for peace. It might simply be a fleet that had never faced anything capable of testing it. We moved on to what Calor called the command hall, a wide circular chamber at the heart of the ship where officers monitored the fleet's status through floating displays of soft light. It was beautiful, almost artistic, more like a planetarium than a war room. Numbers and shapes drifted lazily through the air, tracking distant patrol routes and resource levels across dozens of systems. This is where decisions are made, when decisions must be made, Calor said, though as Commander Ostrin mentioned, it has been quite peaceful for some time. How many ships does the Concordat maintain, across all member worlds? I asked, genuinely curious now, setting aside the diplomatic caution for a moment. Calor answered without hesitation, clearly proud of the number. Just under 4,000 vessels of the Guardian class, spread across our territory. It is more than sufficient to maintain order. 4,000 ships, built to a 600-year-old design, that had not seen real combat in 2 centuries. I did the math in my head, and felt something shift in my chest, somewhere between disbelief and quiet excitement. Before we left the command hall, Calor offered to show us one more room, a small archive chamber tucked behind the main displays where the Concordat kept records of what it called significant historical moments. Calor seemed eager to share it, the way a proud descendant might show off an old family photograph. Inside, soft light illuminated floating images and recordings, drifting slowly past like leaves on a quiet river. Calor guided us toward one particular recording, dimmed with age, showing a handful of small, battered ships scattering away from a formation of guardian vessels. "This is the encounter I mentioned earlier," Calor said. "The last true test of our fleet, 2 centuries past. The raiders numbered perhaps a dozen vessels, poorly equipped, desperate for resources. Our formation numbered over 200. They fled the moment our ships entered visual range." "No casualties," Threll added, with clear satisfaction. "On either side. That is the outcome we always hope for. Strength used only to prevent conflict, never to cause it." Olivia leaned closer to the recording, studying the shapes of the raider vessels with professional interest. "What happened to them afterward? The raiders?" "They were escorted to the nearest neutral system and released," Ostrin said. "We do not believe in lasting punishment for those who choose to surrender. It is not the way of the Concordat." I found myself nodding along, genuinely moved by the story despite myself. There was something admirable in a civilization that could end a conflict without ending lives, that could win simply by being too large to challenge. But even as I nodded, a colder thought moved underneath the admiration. A dozen desperate raiders fleeing from 200 ships was not really a test. It was a mismatch so large it barely counted as an encounter at all. "Has the Concordat ever faced an opponent that did not flee?" Doyle asked, his tone still carefully neutral. The archive chamber went quiet again. Calor glanced at Ostrin, as if unsure whether to answer. Ostrin finally spoke, its voice slower than before. "Not in recorded memory," it admitted. "Every recorded encounter across our history has ended the same way, once the size of our fleet became clear. We have never needed to discover what happens when an opponent does not retreat." "That must be comforting," I said, and I meant it, though not entirely in the way Ostrin seemed to take it. "It is," Ostrin said. "It means our strength has done exactly what strength should do: prevent conflict before it begins, rather than resolve it after." We left the archive chamber not long after, but the story stayed with me. A fleet of 4,000 ships, unchanged for 600 years, that had ended every conflict in its long history simply by being too big to argue with. It was an extraordinary achievement. It was also, I realized with a growing sense of unease, mixed with something close to excitement, a fleet that had never once been forced to actually prove what it could do. Size had done all the work. Not skill, not innovation, not the desperate, restless creativity that comes from a species that has never once had the luxury of being too big to challenge. I thought of home, of shipyards working 3 shifts a day, of engineers who redesigned entire weapon systems every few years because standing still, even for a decade, felt like an unacceptable risk. We had never had 4,000 ships that nobody dared test. We had built everything we owned assuming, every single day, that someone eventually would. Threll must have noticed something in my expression, because it turned to me with what I was beginning to recognize as genuine curiosity, rather than condescension. "You seem thoughtful, Ethan Bailey. What troubles you?" I chose my words with care. "I am simply trying to understand the scale of what you have built. It is impressive." "It should be reassuring," Threll said. "This is what awaits your people, once you are welcomed fully into the Concordat. Protection on a scale you cannot yet imagine, peace maintained not through fear, but through overwhelming patient strength." "And what does the Concordat expect from new members?" Doyle asked. "In terms of contribution, surely you don't protect everyone for nothing." "Cooperation," Threll answered simply. "Resources, when needed, and in time, once a species has proven itself stable and controlled, perhaps a small contribution to the shared fleet. Though for a species as young as yours, that expectation remains a very long way off." I noticed Vex Calor watching me closely during this exchange, the way a student watches a rival during an exam, trying to guess how much they actually know. Eventually, curiosity won out over its own caution. "Might I ask something directly?" Calor said. Does your species possess anything resembling organized defense vessels, even simple ones? The command hall went a little quieter, or maybe that was just my own focus narrowing. Doyle glanced at me, and something passed between us, an old understanding built from years of working together, even though we had only just met on this mission. Neither of us answered immediately, and that silence alone seemed to tell Calor something. "We have some vessels," I said carefully. "Nothing at the scale you have described." Calor nodded, satisfied, clearly filing that answer away as confirmation of everything it had assumed about us. "That is understandable. Most young species take generations to develop even basic orbital defense. It is nothing to be ashamed of." Ostrin placed a long hand gently on my shoulder, an oddly warm gesture from a being that had spent the entire tour speaking like a teacher lecturing a classroom. "In time, you will see ships like these," it said, gesturing toward the Guardian vessels resting in their bays. "And you will understand what true strength feels like. Strength that does not need to prove itself, because it has already proven itself long ago." I looked out through the viewing panel at those 4,000 ships, unchanged for 6 centuries, untested for 2, and I thought about the shipyards back home, quietly working around the clock for the last 100 years, built not out of patience, but out of a history that had never once given us the luxury of exhaustion turning into peace. "Perhaps," I said, "it would be fair for you to see what we have built as well, so we can understand each other properly." Threll's dark eyes studied me for a long moment, and for the first time since we had met, something like genuine interest replaced the gentle condescension in its expression. "That," Threll said slowly, "would be a valuable exercise. We would very much like to see what your young species has managed to create." Doyle caught my eye from across the room, and I saw the faintest ghost of a smile cross his face, the first one I had seen from him since this whole mission began. "We would be happy to arrange that," he said, "sooner rather than later." Neither Threll nor Calor nor Ostrin had any idea what they had just agreed to. 2 weeks passed before the arrangements were finished. 2 weeks of quiet, careful planning back on Earth, where I sat in rooms full of admirals and engineers who spoke about the upcoming visit with an energy I had not expected. Nobody seemed nervous anymore. If anything, they seemed eager, like a team that had trained in secret for years and had finally been given a chance to play. Admiral Henry Cole led the planning. He was an older man, gray at the temples, with the kind of quiet confidence that came from decades spent solving problems most people never knew existed. When I told him about the Guardian-class ships, about the 600-year-old design and the 4,000 vessels that had not truly fought in 2 centuries, he listened without interrupting, then nodded slowly. "Numbers like that only work if nobody ever calls the bluff," he said. "Sounds like nobody ever has." "You think it's a bluff?" "I think it's a fleet, built for a galaxy that forgot how to be desperate," Cole said. "We haven't had that luxury. Not once. In our entire history. Every ship we've ever built was built by people who were scared of something. Scared of each other, mostly, before we finally scared ourselves into cooperating instead." That phrase stuck with me. Scared ourselves into cooperating. It was not the same as being exhausted into peace, the way Threll had described the Concordat's history. It was something rougher, something we were still working on, day by day, but it had produced things the Concordat had apparently never needed to build. The day of the visit arrived under a clear sky over the Atlantic coast, where our primary orbital elevator connected the surface to Earth's largest shipyard station. Threll, Ostrin, and Calor arrived aboard a small shuttle of their own, escorted respectfully by Grace Whitfield, who had been assigned to fly alongside them the entire trip up. I met them at the station's main observation deck, a long curved room with windows looking out over rows of docked vessels stretching farther than the eye could easily follow. Threll's expression, usually calm and pleasantly composed, shifted slightly as it took in the sheer number of ships resting in the yard. "This is a significant amount of construction for a species your age," Threll said, its tone careful, measuring. "We have been busy," I said. Cole stepped forward and extended a hand, a human gesture that Threll copied a beat too late, clearly having studied it from some briefing but never practiced it. "Admiral Henry Cole," he said, "welcome to Earth's primary fleet yard. We thought, since you were kind enough to show us your ships, it was only fair we return the favor." "We appreciate the gesture," Ostron said, though its dark eyes lingered on the rows of docked vessels a moment longer than politeness required. "Though I confess, we did not expect such an extensive display for what your species considers early defense infrastructure." "This isn't our full fleet," Cole said simply. "This is one yard, one of several." I watched Calor's posture shift, just slightly, the confident ease it had carried during our tour of the Guardian vessels, replaced by something more careful. "We have arranged a demonstration," Cole continued, "a standard exercise, nothing beyond what we run regularly for training purposes. We thought you might find it informative." Threll inclined its head. "We would welcome the opportunity to observe your capabilities firsthand." We were led to a viewing gallery built specifically for exercises like this, rows of seats facing a massive window that looked directly out onto open space beyond the station. Screens along the walls displayed live feeds from multiple angles, tracking ship positions and formations in real time. I sat beside Threll, with Doyle and Cole nearby, while Ostron and Calor took seats slightly behind us, watching everything with quiet intensity. "The exercise will begin shortly," Cole said, glancing at a datapad in his hand. "You will be observing a single defense wing, 12 vessels, standard configuration, nothing experimental." 12, Threll repeated, something almost relieved in its tone, as if that number felt manageable, familiar. 12 ships emerged from the shipyard's docking bays in smooth, coordinated formation, sliding into open space, with a precision that made Olivia, seated a few rows back, let out a low whistle of appreciation. They were nothing like the Guardian vessels we had seen aboard the Concordat flagship. Where those ships had been long, curved, and elegant, ours were angular, dense, built with a kind of aggressive efficiency that left no wasted space. Weapon housings were visible along every hull, clearly designed rather than hidden, unapologetic about their purpose. "These are Falcon-class destroyers," Cole explained, "our primary defense vessel, currently in service for roughly 15 years. 15 years, Calor said quietly, and I heard something shift in its voice, a note of surprise it had not managed to fully hide. "They are due for replacement next year," Cole added, almost casually. "We are already testing the next generation." Before the maneuvers began, Ostron leaned forward slightly, studying the destroyers with the careful attention of someone trying to find a flaw. "Your vessels appear crowded," it observed. "Every surface seems occupied by some system or another. Our Guardian class maintains open space within its hull, for comfort, for calm movement between sections." "We don't build for comfort," Doyle said. "We build for output. Every square inch of that hull is doing something useful. Sensors, shielding, propulsion, or weapons. Nothing on that ship exists just to look nice." "That seems an uncomfortable way to live," Ostron said. "It's an uncomfortable galaxy, from where we're sitting," Doyle replied. "We'd rather be crowded and ready than spacious and surprised." Threll turned toward me, curiosity briefly overtaking its earlier caution. "You mentioned, aboard our flagship, that your history has not allowed for what we called exhaustion into peace. Might I ask what did shape your species instead?" I thought carefully before answering, aware that whatever I said next would likely define how the Concordat understood us from this point forward. "We fought amongst ourselves for most of our history," I said. "Different nations, different beliefs, different resources, all competing on a single small planet with nowhere else to go. We built weapons to threaten each other long before we built ships to leave home. By the time we finally looked up at the stars seriously, we already knew exactly how quickly cooperation could fall apart, and exactly how fast we needed to be able to respond if it did." "That sounds like a difficult path," Threll said. "It was," I said. "But it meant that by the time something like your Concordat finally came to visit us, we were not starting from nothing. We were starting from 100 years of never being allowed to relax. Ostrin's dark eyes moved slowly across the 12 waiting destroyers, and for the first time, I thought I saw something like true reassessment happening behind that calm alien face. The formation moved through a series of coordinated maneuvers, splitting apart and reforming with a speed and precision that clearly startled our guests. Threll's hands, resting calmly in its lap until now, tightened slightly. "The speed of their formation changes," Threll said. "How is this achieved?" "Distributed command architecture," Cole said. "Every ship in the formation can take lead position if needed. No single point of failure. It took us about a decade to perfect. After we learned the hard way, what happens when you rely on one central command ship too heavily." "Learned the hard way," Threll repeated softly. The screens shifted to show a target simulation, a series of drone vessels launched from a separate section of the yard, programmed to behave like hostile intruders testing the formation's response. What followed happened fast, faster than I think our guests were prepared for. The 12 destroyers responded to the simulated threat in under 4 seconds. Weapon systems tracking, formations adjusting, defensive countermeasures deploying in a smooth, practiced sequence that ended with every simulated target neutralized before it came anywhere close to the formation's outer edge. The viewing gallery went silent. I glanced sideways at Threll and saw something I had not seen since we first met: genuine uncertainty. 4 seconds, Ostrin said quietly from behind us. "Your response time was 4 seconds. "That's actually a bit slower than our best crews manage," Cole said. "Standard training exercise, remember. Nothing beyond routine." Callor leaned forward toward Cole, its earlier confident curiosity replaced with something more urgent. "How long has your species maintained fleets capable of this kind of coordination?" Cole considered the question for a moment, glancing at Doyle before answering. "Depends how you count it. We've had organized naval forces on our own planet for a few thousand years. Space-based defense, maybe 100 years, though the real advancements happened in the last 30, once things got serious." 100 years, Threll said, almost to itself. "Our Guardian class has served 600 years without needing significant revision." "We revise ours every few years," Cole said. "Sometimes every few months, if intelligence suggests we need to. Standing still isn't something we've ever felt safe doing." The exercise continued for another 20 minutes, showcasing formation changes, long-range weapon tests against unmanned targets far beyond the yard, and a final demonstration where the entire wing performed a rapid withdrawal and counter-formation in response to a simulated ambush scenario. Each phase drew quieter and quieter reactions from our guests. The confident authority I had first encountered aboard their diplomatic ship steadily eroding into something closer to careful, controlled alarm. When the exercise finally ended and the 12 destroyers returned smoothly to their docking positions, Threll turned to me, its expression unreadable in a way it had not been before. "Ethan Bailey," it said slowly, "I must ask you something directly, and I would appreciate an honest answer." "Of course. Is this the extent of your species' capability, or is this, as your admiral suggested, merely a routine display?" I glanced at Cole, who gave the faintest nod, permission granted. "This wing is currently stationed here for training exercises," I said. "It is one of several dozen similar formations distributed across our solar system. It is not our newest design. It is not our largest formation. It is, as the admiral said, routine." Callor made a sound that might have been the alien equivalent of a sharp breath. Ostrin said nothing at all, simply staring out at the now empty patch of space where the destroyers had performed their exercise. Threll was quiet for a long moment before speaking again. "You said during our tour of the flagship that your species had, and I believe your exact words were, some vessels. Nothing at the scale we had described." "That was true," I said. "We do not have 4,000 ships built to a single unchanged design. We have something different, many designs constantly changing, built by people who have never once had the comfort of assuming nobody would ever test them." Callor was the first to break the silence. though its voice had lost every trace of the confident curiosity it carried during our earlier tour. "The vessels used in your simulation," it said, "the drones representing hostile intruders. What was their intended threat level, compared to a real adversary?" "Roughly comparable to a mid-tier raiding force," Cole said. "Nothing exotic. We calibrate our training simulations against threats we consider realistic, not theoretical extremes." "And your response time of 4 seconds," Ostrin said slowly, "was described as slower than your best crews manage." "That's correct," Cole said. "Best crews average closer to 2.5. This wing is competent, but not our top tier." "May we see your top-tier formation?" Calor asked, and there was something almost desperate in the question now, a need to understand the true shape of what it was dealing with. Cole glanced at Doyle, a silent conversation passing between them before he answered. "That formation is not currently stationed for public demonstration," he said. "Perhaps in time, once trust has been properly established between our peoples." It was a careful answer, diplomatic on its surface, but I understood exactly what it meant, and judging by the stillness that settled over Threll and Ostrin, so did they. We were not showing them everything. We had shown them a training exercise, one wing among dozens, and even that had been enough to shatter every assumption they walked in with. Grace, standing quietly near the back of the gallery, caught my eye and gave the smallest shake of her head, somewhere between disbelief and amusement. I understood the feeling. A week ago, these same beings had called our rockets basic and our stations early. Now Ostrin was asking permission to see more, carefully, respectfully, the way a student asks a teacher for one more lesson. The silence that followed felt different from every silence that had come before it during our meetings with the Concordat. It was not the polite, patient silence of a species confident in its own place in the universe. It was the silence of someone recalculating everything they thought they understood, and not particularly enjoying what the new numbers were telling them. "I believe," Threll said finally, its voice quieter than I had ever heard it, "that we have significantly misjudged the nature of your species." Cole allowed himself the smallest, most professional smile. "It happens," he said. "We get misjudged a lot, usually only once." After the demonstration ended, our guests were led to a private lounge aboard the station to rest before their return journey. I walked with Grace along a quiet corridor overlooking the shipyard, watching the 12 destroyers settle back into their docking cradles below us. "You should have seen Calor's face during the withdrawal maneuver," Grace said. "I thought its translator was going to short out from confusion. It kept asking about response times," I said, like the numbers themselves were the part it couldn't accept. "Numbers are easy to argue with," Grace said. "Watching something happen in 4 seconds, right in front of you, is a lot harder to explain away afterward." We reached the observation window at the end of the corridor, where the shipyard stretched out beneath us, rows of hulls under construction lit by working lights that never really went dark. Somewhere further along that same yard, hidden behind restricted access panels neither Threll nor Ostrin had been shown, sat the newest generation of vessels Cole had mentioned earlier, still in testing, still unfinished, already outperforming everything we had just demonstrated. "You think they suspect there's more?" Grace asked. "I think Ostrin already knows there's more," I said. "It's the only thing that explains why it asked to see our top-tier formation instead of just thanking us politely and leaving." Grace was quiet for a moment, watching the lights below. "A week ago they thought we were basically children playing with rockets," she said. "Now they're asking permission to see what else we've got. That's a fast turnaround, even for a species with translator devices." "It's not really about speed," I said. "It's about what they built their whole identity around. 4,000 ships, untested for 2 centuries, a design that never needed to change. That works fine, right up until you meet someone who's never had the luxury of standing still." "And now they have," Grace said. "Now they have." We stood there a while longer, neither of us saying much else, watching the shipyard hum quietly beneath the stars. Somewhere behind us, in the private lounge set aside for our guests, Threll, Ostrin, and Calor were almost certainly having a very different conversation than the one they had planned before boarding their shuttle that morning. I found myself wondering what records they were pulling up now, what old assumptions about young species they were quietly setting aside, and how long it would take before the Concordat itself found out that the newest, smallest, least experienced member of its future family had spent the last century building things nobody back home had ever thought to imagine. For the first time since this whole strange journey began, I did not feel like the nervous translator standing at the edge of something too large to understand. I felt like someone watching a very old, very confident story quietly rewrite itself in real time. 3 days after the demonstration, Threll requested an urgent meeting, this time not aboard a ship, but at our own diplomatic office on the surface, a modest building overlooking the coast that had been set aside for exactly this kind of exchange. I arrived early and found Doyle already there, standing by the window with a datapad in hand, and an expression I had never seen on him before, something close to quiet satisfaction mixed with genuine curiosity. They requested access to our historical archives, he said, before I could even ask. Not our defense records, our history, wars, treaties, arms development, all of it. Said they wanted to understand us properly before continuing negotiations. We agreed? Cole agreed to release the public record, Doyle said. Nothing classified, just what any historian on Earth could already find. He figured if they were going to draw conclusions about us, they should at least draw them from real information instead of assumptions. Threll arrived shortly after, accompanied not by Ostrin or Kaller this time, but by 2 figures I did not recognize, older-looking Concordat officials wrapped in deeper, darker robes than anything I had seen before. Threll introduced them simply as members of the Concordat Historical Council, specialists brought in specifically to review what had been shared. We have spent the last 2 days studying your records, Threll said, once we were all seated in the quiet meeting room. Its voice, usually calm and measured, carried a new weight, something almost hesitant. I must confess, we did not expect what we found. One of the historical council members, an older figure who had not yet spoken, finally addressed us directly. Its translator rendered its voice lower, more careful than Threll's. Your species has fought among itself continuously for the entirety of your recorded history, it said, not occasional disputes, continuous, overlapping conflicts across every region of your world for thousands of years, right up until the era in which you began reaching for space. That's an accurate summary, Doyle said, without flinching. And your weapons development, the council member continued, shows a pattern unlike anything in our records of any other species. Each new tool your civilization created, agricultural, industrial, computational, was adapted for defense or conflict within a remarkably short span of time, sometimes within the same generation that invented it, just not always about the right lessons. Threll leaned forward slightly. This is what troubles us, Ethan Bailey. Our own history taught us that conflict fades once a civilization matures, once cooperation proves more useful than competition. Your history suggests the opposite. Your civilization matured precisely because of that competition, not despite it. I thought about how to answer that honestly, without either overstating our progress or hiding from our history. We are not proud of most of it, I said, but we didn't get the luxury your worlds had, apparently. No slow cooling off period after a few great conflicts settled things for good. We just kept going, era after era, learning new ways to compete faster than we learned new ways to cooperate. And yet you did learn cooperation eventually, the second council member said, its voice quieter, more thoughtful. Your defense wing demonstrated coordination between many independent vessels working as a single unit. That requires deep trust, deep cooperation. How did a species with your history manage that? Because the alternative was worse, Doyle said simply. Once we started building things capable of true destruction, cooperation stopped being a nice idea and became survival. We didn't cooperate because we grew wise. We cooperated because the other option was losing everything, including each other. Threll and the council members exchanged a long look, something passing between them that their calm faces did not fully explain. Finally, Threll spoke again. "Our records describe 43 species who joined the Concordat before yours," it said. "Every one of them followed a similar path to ours. Long periods of internal conflict, followed by exhaustion, followed by centuries of stability and slow, careful growth. Your species appears to have compressed that entire process into a fraction of the time, without ever fully setting aside the urgency that drove it." "We didn't get exhausted into peace," I said, echoing back the phrase Threll itself had used aboard the flagship. "We're still working on the peace part, but the urgency never really left. We just learned to build things instead of just fighting with them." The historical council members spent a long moment in what looked like private discussion, their translators briefly muted while they conferred quietly between themselves. When they finished, the older one addressed the room again. "We must revise our understanding," it said. "We assumed your species required careful preparation before meaningful contact, the way every previous species has required. We now believe this assumption was incorrect. Your species has already prepared itself, through methods our history never required and would likely never have survived." "Is that a compliment?" I asked, only half joking. "It is an observation," the council member said. "Whether it should be considered a compliment depends entirely on what your species chooses to do with what it has built." The older council member continued, almost thinking aloud now rather than addressing us directly. "We noted 2 periods in your recorded history where conflict spread across nearly your entire world at once, drawing in almost every nation you had. Both periods ended not through exhaustion alone, as ours did, but through the sudden arrival of weapons so powerful that continuing became unthinkable for every side involved. Your species then spent the following decades locked in a standoff between 2 great powers, each holding enough destructive capability to end the other, and yet neither ever chose to use it. That standoff lasted the better part of a century," Doyle said. "A lot of very careful, very frightened people made a lot of very careful decisions during that time. It taught us something the easy way never could have. Restraint isn't the absence of power, it's choosing not to use power you actually have." "That is a difficult lesson," the council member said. "Many species never learn it at all. They either never develop enough power to need restraint, or they develop it and fail the test the very first time it matters. We came close to failing a few times," I admitted. "Closer than most people back home like to talk about. But we didn't, and every generation since has built on top of that same restraint, right alongside all the new technology. That's probably the part your records won't fully explain. We didn't just build stronger tools. We built a habit of not using the strongest ones unless we had no other choice." Threll folded its long hands together, studying the two of us with an expression I still could not fully read. "That habit," it said slowly, "may be the single most important detail in your entire history. Strength without restraint destroys itself eventually. Restraint without strength simply gets overrun by those who have both. Your species appears to have found something our own history never quite required us to develop in the same way. Strength paired with a very deliberate, very hard-won discipline." The room fell quiet again, and I noticed Doyle glance toward me, the smallest flicker of something unspoken passing between us. We both understood that this conversation had shifted from a simple review of history into something closer to the Concordat quietly rewriting its entire understanding of what a young species could actually be. That comment settled over the room in a way that felt heavier than anything said before it. Threll shifted in its seat, its earlier calm composure now edged with something that looked almost like concern. "There is another matter we must raise," Threll said carefully. "Our fleet command has reviewed the footage from your demonstration. They have asked me to inquire, formally, whether your species intends to seek membership within the Concordat as originally discussed, or whether your recent developments suggest a different path forward." I understood immediately what that question really meant. It was not really about membership forms or formal procedures. It was about whether humanity intended to join the Concordat as a small, cooperative new member, quietly accepting its place among 43 older species, or whether we intended to arrive as something the Concordat had never actually planned for, a new kind of member entirely. Doyle answered before I could, his voice calm but absolutely certain. "We still want to join," he said. "We want cooperation, trade, shared knowledge, all of it. We're not looking for conflict with anyone, especially not people who traveled this far just to say hello. But we're also not interested in pretending we're smaller than we are. If the Concordat wants us as a partner, it should know exactly what kind of partner it's getting." Threll studied Doyle for a long moment, and then, slowly, nodded. "I believe," it said, "that our council will need considerably more time to properly consider what that partnership should look like." As the meeting drew to a close, and our guests prepared to return to their shuttle, Threll lingered for a moment near the doorway, turning back toward me one last time. "Ethan Bailey," it said quietly, "when we first met, I called your species young. I still believe that is true, in terms of years, but I no longer believe young means what I once assumed it meant." "What do you think it means now?" I asked. Threll considered the question carefully before answering. "I think it means your species has not yet decided what kind of civilization it intends to become, only that it will not become that civilization slowly, or quietly, or the way any of us expected." It left without waiting for a response, and I stood there in the quiet meeting room for a long time afterward, thinking about how quickly an entire species had gone from calling us children to asking, very carefully, what kind of future we were planning to build. Later that evening, I sat with Cole in his office, giving him a full account of the meeting while the sun set over the coastline outside his window. He listened quietly, the way he always did, letting me finish before he said anything at all. "They're scared," he said finally, "not of an attack, of the unknown. They built their whole identity around being the biggest, oldest, most patient civilization in the neighborhood. Now they've met someone younger, who somehow got just as strong, just a lot faster, and they don't know what that means for the story they've been telling themselves for centuries." "Do you think that's dangerous?" I asked. "Them being scared of us?" "Could go either way," Cole said. "Scared people either try to make peace quickly, or they try to make sure they never have to worry about the thing that scared them again. Our job now is making sure they choose the first option." "How do we do that?" Cole leaned back in his chair, considering the question with the same careful weight he gave every decision that actually mattered. "By being exactly what we already are," he said, "strong enough that nobody thinks about testing us, and steady enough that nobody feels like they need to. We've spent a long time learning how to hold both of those at once. Now we just have to prove we can do it in front of an audience that's never seen anyone manage it before." I thought about Threll's words from earlier that day, about a species that had not yet decided what kind of civilization it intended to become. Maybe that uncertainty was not a weakness after all. Maybe it was simply the truth about every species young enough to still be writing its own story, one choice at a time, with an entire galaxy now watching to see how the next chapter would go. Outside Cole's window, the last light faded over the water, and somewhere far above us, a silver shuttle, carrying 3 very thoughtful ambassadors, made its slow way back toward a ship that suddenly felt a great deal less certain of its place in the universe than it had only a few weeks earlier. A month passed before the Concordat sent its formal response, and when it finally arrived, it did not come through Threll or Ostron or Calor. It came through a full delegation, larger than anything we had seen before, arriving aboard a vessel none of us recognized, longer and heavier than even the flagship we had visited, its hull marked with symbols that Olivia later identified as belonging to the highest ranks of Concordat leadership. I was summoned to the coastal office early that morning, still holding a cup of coffee I never got the chance to finish. Doyle met me at the entrance, his expression unusually alert for that hour. "They brought the whole council this time," he said. "Not just historians, fleet command, trade representatives, even what looks like their version of a head of state." "That's a lot of attention for one small young species," I said. "Guess we're not quite so small anymore," Doyle said. "At least not in the ways that matter to people who count fleets for a living." Inside the main meeting hall, a room I had grown used to seeing half empty during our earlier conversations, every seat was now filled. Threll sat near the front, though it no longer looked like the senior figure in the room. Beside it sat a tall, silver-robed figure, introduced simply as Chief Counselor Van, flanked by Ostron and several other officers whose ranks I did not fully understand. Counselor Van spoke first, its voice deeper and slower than Threll's, carrying the weight of someone used to being listened to without interruption. "We have spent the past cycle reviewing everything gathered during our initial contact with your species," Van said. "Historical records, demonstrations of capability, and detailed reports from our ambassadors regarding your conduct, your reasoning, and your intentions." "We appreciate the thoroughness," Cole said, seated beside Doyle near the front of our own delegation. "Our original process," Van continued, "calls for a lengthy period of observation before any species is granted formal standing within the Concordat. Decades, sometimes centuries, depending on how quickly that species demonstrates stability. This process exists because history has shown us that power without patience tends toward disaster, both for the species that holds it and for everyone unfortunate enough to stand nearby." I felt a small knot form in my chest, unsure where this was heading. "Your species," Van said, "presents a challenge to that process unlike any we have previously encountered. You demonstrate power that, by our estimation, rivals or exceeds several long-standing Concordat members, achieved in a fraction of the time we believed necessary for such development. And yet, our historical review also shows a species that has, repeatedly, chosen restraint at moments when destruction would have been the easier path." Van paused, glancing briefly toward Threll before continuing. "Ambassador Threll's reports describe a species that listens carefully, speaks honestly even when honesty is inconvenient, and shows no interest in using its capability to intimidate or dominate those it meets. This does not match the pattern our process was designed to guard against." "So where does that leave us?" Doyle asked, direct as ever. "It leaves us," Van said, "reconsidering the process itself, rather than simply applying it as written. Our fleet command has recommended that your species not be treated as a probationary member requiring decades of observation, but rather as what we might call an early equal partner, granted standing sooner than tradition allows, though with continued cooperation expected as trust deepens further on both sides." The room went quiet for a moment as that statement settled in. I glanced at Doyle, who kept his composed expression, though I noticed his hand tighten slightly on the edge of the table in front of him, the only sign of how significant this moment actually was. "We would welcome that arrangement," Cole said carefully, "though I want to be clear about something, Counselor. We are not seeking status for the sake of status. We want cooperation because we believe it's better for everyone, including us, than standing alone. That was true before this meeting, and it remains true now." "We believe you," Van said, and for the first time since I had begun working with the Concordat, I heard something in an alien voice that sounded almost like genuine respect rather than careful diplomatic courtesy. "That belief, more than your fleet, is the true reason for our decision today." Over the following hours, the details of the arrangement were worked through, carefully, formally, with representatives from both sides trading proposals and adjustments late into the evening. I found myself pulled from my original role as a simple translator into something closer to a genuine advisor, consulted on nuance and tone in ways I had never expected when this whole journey began weeks earlier. Threll, seated nearby for most of the discussion, occasionally leaned over to ask my opinion on a phrase or a translation choice, treating me now less like a curiosity from a young species and more like a colleague working through a shared problem. During a short break in the proceedings, Threll found me alone near the same coastal window where I had once watched its shuttle disappear after our very first meeting. "You seem different today," Threll said, joining me at the window. "Everyone keeps telling me that," I said. "I'm not sure I feel different, just tired." "Perhaps that is what different feels like. For your species," Threll said. "A month ago, I stood in a room, believing I understood exactly what kind of civilization you were. Young, hopeful, still finding your place among the stars. I still believe the hopeful part. I no longer believe the rest, at least not in the way I once did. What do you believe now? I asked. Threll considered the question with the same careful patience it brought to everything. I believe your species learned something ours never had to learn, it said. We built peace by running out of reasons to fight. You built it by refusing to stop building, even after you had every reason to feel safe enough not to. I do not know which path serves a civilization better in the long run. I only know that watching your species choose restraint, again and again, despite never being forced to by exhaustion the way we were, has taught our council something we did not expect to learn from a species we once called young. And what's that? That patience is not the only path to peace, Threll said. Sometimes urgency, properly guided, arrives at the same destination simply by a very different road. I thought about that for a long moment, watching the last of the evening light spread out over the water below us. For what it's worth, I said, I think our two paths might actually be good for each other. You've had centuries to learn what happens after peace holds. We've had centuries learning what it costs to build peace in the first place. Maybe that's worth more together than either one alone. Threll's dark eyes studied me for a long moment, and then it did something I had never seen it do before. A small, deliberate nod, the kind reserved for an equal, rather than a curiosity being observed from a careful distance. I believe our council would agree, it said. During the negotiations that filled the following 2 days, I watched Doyle and Cole work through details most people back home would never hear about. Quotas for shared research, protocols for joint patrols along contested trade routes, and careful language describing how disputes between our two peoples would be resolved going forward. Van's team pushed for slower integration in several areas, still cautious despite everything they had seen, while Doyle pushed back gently but firmly wherever he felt speed actually served both sides better than caution. At one point, a younger member of the Concordat Trade Council raised a concern that our defense capabilities might eventually be used to pressure smaller, less developed Concordat worlds during future trade discussions. Doyle addressed it directly, without hesitation. We didn't build what we have to bully anyone, he said. We built it because we couldn't afford not to, given where we come from. If anything, we'd rather use it to make sure nobody else ever has to learn the same hard lessons we did. Strength isn't worth much if the only thing it teaches you is how to threaten people smaller than you. Van had listened to that exchange quietly, and later, during a private aside with Cole, mentioned that it was answers like that one, more than any single demonstration of capability, that had truly shifted the Council's confidence in moving forward quickly. Olivia, who had spent the negotiation period buried in technical exchanges with Concordat engineers, comparing propulsion systems and shielding technology, found me during one of the breaks, practically buzzing with excitement. Their shielding tech is incredible, she said, centuries ahead of anything we've built, but our propulsion efficiency leaves theirs in the dust. It's like we've each been solving completely different halves of the same puzzle this whole time. Sounds like a good reason to actually work together, I said. That's exactly what I told them, Olivia said. You should have seen their engineers' faces when I showed them our latest drive specifications. I don't think Concordat engineers get surprised very often. By the third day, the framework of the agreement was complete, covering trade, shared defense cooperation along neutral borders, exchange programs between our engineers and theirs, and a formal timeline for deeper integration that both sides agreed to revisit and adjust as trust continued to grow. It was not a perfect agreement, and both Cole and Van acknowledged as much publicly, but it was honest, built on what each side had actually seen of the other, rather than on assumptions carried in from centuries of expecting every young species to behave exactly the same way. The formal agreement was signed 3 days later, in a quiet ceremony broadcast to every screen on Earth, and, I was told, to every member world across the Concordat as well. I stood near the back of the room during the signing, no longer required as translator, since both sides now had systems capable of handling the language directly. Instead, I simply watched, along with billions of other people across our planet, as humanity's name was formally added to a list of civilizations that had spent generations, sometimes centuries, earning the same recognition we had reached in barely more than a month. Afterward, Cole found me near the edge of the gathering, watching the Concordat delegation prepare to depart. "You did good work, Bailey," he said. "Better than good, honestly. Nobody expected a translator to end up steering half these conversations." "I just told them the truth," I said. "Seemed like the simplest strategy available." "Simplest strategy is usually the hardest one to actually follow," Cole said. "Most people panic and either oversell themselves or downplay everything out of fear. You didn't do either. That's rarer than you'd think, even among people who've been doing this a lot longer than you." I watched the Concordat shuttle lift off in the distance, carrying Threll, Van, and the rest of the delegation back toward the great silver ship, still waiting patiently in orbit above us. A month ago, that same shuttle had arrived carrying beings who believed they were about to introduce a young, hopeful species to the wonders of a much larger universe. Now it carried beings who understood, in a way their history had never quite prepared them for, that some young species did not wait patiently for centuries to earn their place among the stars. Some built that place themselves, one restless, careful, hard-won decade at a time. That evening, I stood once more at the coastal window, alone this time, watching the sky slowly fill with stars I now knew were far less empty than I had ever imagined growing up. Somewhere out there, 43 other worlds were probably hearing the news about us for the first time, learning that the newest member of their careful, patient community had arrived not with centuries of quiet growth behind it, but with something else entirely, a history built from urgency, restraint, and a stubborn refusal to ever stop preparing for whatever might come next. I thought about Threll's words from our very first meeting, about how peace, to the Concordat, had always been the natural end of a long, tired road. For humanity, I realized, peace had never been the end of anything. It was simply the choice we kept making, every single day, standing right beside the kind of strength that could have ended everything, and deciding, again and again, not to. The galaxy had come looking for a species it could gently guide toward its own quiet, patient version of peace. What it found instead was a species that had already built its own version, forged not from exhaustion, but from 100 years of never once looking away from the possibility of conflict, and choosing, every single time, to build something better instead. Somewhere far above me, that great silver ship finally turned away from Earth, carrying its passengers home, with a great deal more to think about than they had carried on the journey here. And somewhere deep in every shipyard scattered across our solar system, the quiet work continued, exactly as it always had, not out of fear anymore, and not entirely out of habit either, but out of a simple, steady understanding that had carried us this far already. Later that night, after the delegation had departed and the coastal office had finally gone quiet, Doyle found me still standing near the window, watching the last traces of the Concordat shuttle fade into the dark sky. "Big day," he said, joining me with 2 cups of coffee, handing one over without asking if I wanted it. "Strange day," I said. "A month ago I was terrified of saying the wrong word to Threll during a first greeting. Today I watched our 2 species sign something that's probably going to be studied for the next 100 years. "Get used to strange," Doyle said. "From here on out, that's basically the job description." I asked him something that had been sitting in the back of my mind since the ceremony ended. "Do you think they're actually comfortable with this, or just being polite because they don't see another option?" Doyle considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things. "Bit of both, probably," he said. "Van strikes me as someone who genuinely respects what we showed them. But I'd bet there are others back on their homeworlds who are a lot more nervous about all this than anyone in that meeting let on. Should we be worried about that?" "Not worried," Doyle said. "Aware. There's a difference. Worry makes you defensive for no reason. Awareness just means you keep doing what we've always done. Stay ready, stay honest, and let the results speak for themselves. That combination is what got us this far. No reason to stop now." We stood there a while longer, drinking coffee that had gone lukewarm somewhere during the conversation, watching the lights of the shipyard reflect faintly against the dark water in the distance. Word of the agreement had already reached every corner of the planet by then, spreading across every screen and broadcast within hours of the signing. I had caught glimpses of the reaction earlier that evening. Crowds gathered in city squares on nearly every continent, watching replays of the ceremony, with a mixture of pride, disbelief, and a kind of nervous excitement that felt very familiar, because I had been feeling exactly the same thing since the moment Threll's shuttle first appeared in our sky. Somewhere in those crowds, I imagined, were people who had grown up believing humanity would always be the smallest, youngest, least significant voice the moment we finally met someone else out among the stars. I wondered how it felt for them, watching that assumption quietly come apart in real time, the same way it had come apart for Threll and Ostrin and Van, one demonstration and one honest conversation at a time. "You know," I said eventually, "when this first started, I kept waiting for the moment they'd realize we weren't ready for any of this. Turns out I had it backward the whole time." "Most people do at first," Doyle said. "Hard to see your own strength clearly when you've spent your whole life just trying to survive long enough to use it. Took an outsider showing up and acting surprised before most of us really understood what we'd actually built." I thought about that for a long time after Doyle finally said goodnight and headed home, leaving me alone once more with the quiet hum of the shipyard below and the vast, patient dark above it. A month ago, an entire civilization had looked at humanity and seen a hopeful, harmless child, still learning to walk among the stars. Now that same civilization was rewriting its oldest assumptions, one careful revision at a time, learning that some children grow up faster than anyone expects, especially the ones who were never given the luxury of growing up slowly in the first place. We were never planning to be anyone's cautionary tale. We were simply getting started,